I have to tell you. Well, I finished the book this morning early. I'm an early riser, and I had scanned it when it came in. They sent me a review copy, and I scanned it when it came in, and then finished it this morning around 6 o'clock. Uh, and I can't recall crying when I've read a leadership book. And so I am reading along, and I hope I don't cry now. I'll have to whip out my hanky. But I'm reading along, and you're talking about being in an airplane. There you
The
go. Thank
tissue.
you. And you're talking about being in an airplane and watching The Intern with Robert De Niro and Anne Hathaway, uh, and the story made me cry this morning. I went to chatted with my wife and told her the story and cried again when I told her the story. So I would love to hear you speak the story of hiring a summer intern. And Paul, I think it's Critchlow.
Paul Critchlow.
Critchlow. Love
Hmm.
to hear the story.
Sure. That is one of the most moving experiences I've had as well. So I was flying back to New York from a business trip and was a bit tired and reeled up a movie on the screen. And I watched The Intern, which starred Robert De Niro. And it was about a young woman who ran her own business and ended up having an older gentleman be part of her intern group. And when I watched this movie on the plane, I started to tear up a little bit because what I felt was that I wanted that too. I wanted an older, wiser presence around the office, to be a friend, to be someone without an agenda, who wasn't trying to get your job or their next job, but was really just there for the virtue of being there and being with the others. So when the plane landed, I wiped my tears and went to talk to the head of HR at Pfizer and asked him what he thought. He gave it the green light. And I reached out to Paul Critchlow, who's someone I knew because he had a job similar to mine at Merrill Lynch. He was someone I really admire, who was kind of the go-to guy in my field. So if we were facing a challenge among our team, we would say, well, what would Critchlow do? We might even call him. He would give us great advice. So I invited him to lunch, knowing that he had recently retired. And I had a hunch that he wasn't loving his retirement, but I wasn't sure. So I popped the question over lunch and I said, Paul, have you seen the movie The Intern? He says, nope. I said, well, it explained the premise. And I said, would you consider being my summer intern at Pfizer? And he touched his ear, and I think he was, maybe he thought his hearing aid wasn't working, the question, that he didn't get the question. And he told me he'd think about it overnight, called me the next day, and he said he was in. And I said, look, we pay the interns $18.25 an hour. Please let me give you a consulting contract. He said, I'll take the 18.25. And then I said, well, all right, but please let me give you an office because you're so senior. He said, where do the other interns sit? I said, well, they sit in the bullpen. He says, I'll sit in the bullpen. And over the course of that summer, he became one of the most beloved people in Pfizer. The interns just were charmed by him, and he taught us great lessons, from the Vietnam War, from his career in business and politics. Also, my staff started asking for time with him because what I found is that everybody wants what I wanted, which is that ear for a listen, the shoulder to lean on if you have a problem. And it was really one of the most innovative human resources things I think we've done, and ended up being a great success and covered on the front page of Fast Company magazine.
Yes, yes. So love the story. It actually made me think about Gordon McKinsey. who wrote this book called Orbiting the Giant Hairball. I don't know if you've heard about this or not. Have you heard of his book?
No, I'm not familiar with the book, but
Yeah.
I'm going to make a note. It sounds pretty intriguing.
So it's subtitled A Corporate Fool's Guide to Surviving with Grace. I actually pulled it off the shelf because there were a few parts in the book that made me think about this. And I have to tell you, that's a great compliment. So he was, the book is 1996, I think. He was he at Hallmark Cards, and he's a real creative guy. Just doesn't want to fit the mold. I mean, the table of contents looks like this.
It's very cool. I'm going to check it out.
Yeah. So, and sorry, I mean, we actually want to talk about your book. However, um, there are just parts in that book your book that made me think of McKinsey, who in his final years at Hallmark, they gave him this title. I forget what it was, corporate, guru or something. And they gave him an office but he didn't have a job description. And people would come to see him and they'd bring their ideas and he'd talk to them about their ideas. And he said, I always told them the same thing. I told everybody the same thing. That is a great idea. And out they went.
Well, I heard something really interesting this past week. We had Adam Grant in to talk to our senior management group, and he said we asked the question, "What's the difference between leaders and bosses?" And he said bosses tend to look for a way to say no, and leaders tend to look for a way to say yes.
Hmm. Wonderful. Wonderful. It would seem to me to be a challenge in a large evil empire like Pfizer. And I use the term tongue in cheek. And honestly, when they sent the book and then, they said, you want to talk with Sally, I really thought about it because it's you're in well, you say in the book, you wear your Pfizer t-shirt or sweatshirt around and people say, do you work for Pfizer? You're waiting for the next thing. And some of them hug you and some of them think you're, you know, Satan's belly button or something. So I honestly thought about it, but I just feel like, you have such a great story, and I don't know, I just was intrigued by the whole thing, to tell you the truth. So that's
Well,
pretty
you're
candid.
you're you're making this author's day. To hear that from you, someone who has access to great thinkers in business and leadership, it really, really means a lot. And I get what you're saying about the reputation of big pharma. When I told my boss's wife at Estee Lauder companies that I was leaving Estee Lauder to go to Pfizer, she cried. And she said, you're going to a bad place with bad people. And, it was really a big decision to go from having represented companies that were much loved. American Express is a very popular company, Estee Lauder companies. And it just intrigued me, the idea that these companies make life-saving medicine, and yet they had terrible reputations, down at the bottom by tobacco or oil and gas. And being somewhat naive, I thought I could fix that pretty quickly. And for more than 10 years, I struggled. And I tried different things. I did polling, I researched the problem. And it really wasn't, Dan, until the pandemic that we had the opportunity to recast ourselves and to live up to our promise and to take head on some of the things that had plagued us. I mean, issues around transparency or access and affordability. And it was the moment. And it was a beautiful thing to be a part of it. And that's really what I'm hoping to share in part with my readers, is what that experience was like.
The introduction has your approach to Russia invading Ukraine, which I thought was brilliant. I think so well crafted. The idea that you would say, okay, do we stop selling pharmaceuticals to Russia? Right? Well, there were sick people in Russia, and your decision or your what you crafted was the idea of, well, we're going to continue to sell pharmaceuticals to Russia, but we're going to give the profits to the Ukraine. I just thought that was lovely. It was just brilliant.
Well, companies are faced with really tough challenges all the time. And the situation in Russia and Ukraine was one of the toughest I had seen. You know, it was now just about a year ago, and all the big companies were very visibly pulling out. I think McDonald's did, other big name companies. And it seemed to be the thing that leading multinationals needed to do. And this humanitarian exemption that medicine companies have is historic. But now, we're in an age of tremendous scrutiny on all things. And the idea that we would just, pull out didn't feel right. A kid with cancer in Russia is a kid with cancer, somebody's son, somebody's brother. And we could not in any way imagine denying them their necessary medicine. But at the same time, in the current environment, to just sort of sit back and cross our arms and say, sorry, we have an exemption, didn't feel sufficient either. So we really struggled with this and brainstormed over the course of a weekend and came up with the idea that every penny we earn, we would donate to Ukrainian relief and Ukrainian support, and that we would stick with it as long as it takes, which is another important thing, because you don't want to just do a corporate fad. You need to have your values and really stick by them. So we're still doing that at Pfizer. We've donated over $30 million since the start. And it was a great lesson in navigating your own path and finding a solution that works for you and your company.
I'm curious about the tension or I guess that's the way to say it, the tension between being who you are and authenticity and living by your values and dealing with stakeholders and addressing their needs and, not being, I mean, leaders are pulled in a million directions, right?
Yes.
So like Jim Parker, he was the CEO of Southwest during 9/11. I said, what's your favorite word of advice? He said, be yourself. It was the most underwhelming thing I'd heard in a long while. And it took me a while to even appreciate what he was saying, that, what, people are going to come in, they're going to say, do this. You're going to say, oh, that's a great idea. And then somebody else come in, they're going to say, well, do that. And they're going, oh, that's a great idea. How do you forge a path with so many voices?
It is hard to forge the path right now with a very competitive, competing landscape of stakeholders, all of whom have big social media channels and other ways to, get attention for their causes. And I find the current debate between, sort of what's considered woke capitalism and the anti-woke capitalism debate interesting, but not entirely relevant to those of us who really work inside big companies, because these decisions should never be grounded in politics. We're never making a statement on a Democratic or Republican issue or a conservative or liberal cause. What we do is we work from our values as a company. And maybe that goes to the comment about be yourself. So at Pfizer, we have 4 values: courage, excellence, equity, and joy. And pretty much every decision we make, we put through a matrix that asks some basic questions and relates very much to our values. What I find is when people get in trouble is when they try to say one thing to one constituency group and another thing to a different group. That is a recipe for disaster. People are too smart. The world is too transparent. So having that North Star of your values and sticking with it, I think it's a good way to go.
So one of the values of Pfizer's joy. In the book, you talk some about the forming of those values, and and by the way, love the values are behaviors. And so you talk about what are we going to ask? What are we going to do with each of your values? How do we know we're doing those things? But anyway, you're a self-confessed stick in the mud. How are you
I am.
doing? How are you doing with joy these days?
This may sound like an oxymoron, but I'm working hard on joy. We had these values, and we created them in 2019 when we had a new CEO, Albert Bourla. And joy is a very unusual corporate value. And when we talked about it, I love the ideas resonant in it. For example, we take our work seriously, but not ourselves. Another one is that we believe laughter is good medicine too, which is a pretty bold thing for a pharmaceutical company to say. But when I received feedback from my team, I found I had very low joy scores. And I was humiliated, you know. I think I'm fun, but apparently my team didn't think I was fun. And so I had to do some things very purposefully to bring joy into the workplace. So one night at the end of the day, we hosted something called My Blooper Reel and invited each colleague to share what was their biggest mistake. And I started by sharing mine, which is when I divulged a confidence and paid a heavy price for my mistake. And the next thing you know, everybody had something that they were embarrassed by. And we could tell the stories with good humor because they were in our rear view mirror. And it created a warm environment. So I'm never going to be a comedian, can't tell a joke to save my life. But I did find with focus and attention, I could create a lighter environment,
Mm,
one that was more collegial, and that was really important.
mm. I don't know you. I would imagine that a woman who has risen to high levels of leadership in large corporations has a pretty strong drive. You didn't just stumble your way into these things. Um, how do you kind of navigate this, joy and desire for, you talk a little bit about yoga in the book, and trying to find being centered and all of that. And I love that it's like sort of like, I'm the person who sits in the back, but how does one navigate a real high drive and yet enjoyment?
A really great question that I've never been asked before. I do have a strong drive, and something you may have seen in the book was my argument that we shouldn't feel bad as women about being ambitious. That sometimes people say, you know, she's ambitious.
Right.
Well, heck yes, she's ambitious, and so too are all the guys sitting on the executive floor here at Pfizer.
They
So
just don't get called the same thing these ambitious women get called.
they do not. You're
Right.
right. So, you know, I over the course of nearly 4 decades in corporate life, I've thought a lot about being, being an ambitious person and wanting to express it in ways that are not overly threatening, and to, humanize the workplace whenever I can, whether it's with family photos or sometimes sharing a personal story. But you're right that ambition has to be balanced with self-care because, I kind of refer to it as the oxygen mask theory that they talk about on the airplane. You need to put your own mask on before you can help others. So I try to be healthy. I walk. I have a glass of wine most nights, but not too many glasses. And just simple ways to take care of ourselves, I think really help you live your professional life as a marathon and not a sprint.
Hmm. Thanks for bringing up self-care. It's an interesting uh, word to me. I'm a dairy farm boy from central Maine, and we don't believe in self-care or emotions. So what does self-care look like during a 2 year long crisis? I mean, how did you folks manage that?
We talked a lot about it and did a few things differently. So, for example, we gave each colleague an allowance to make their home space more comfortable for working. So you could get a better chair or a nice headset. Little things like that meant a lot. We gave an extra day that is just for you. You don't have to count it as a sick day or a vacation day, but just a day for your wellness. We call it Wellness Day. We declared a certain amount of time, 2 weeks every 6 months, as focus weeks, where we still meet and talk with each other, but the meetings go down by 80 or 90%. I mean, you can reach out to someone if you need them, but all standing meetings are paused during these focus weeks. And, we found that for some people who were working from home, it was very stressful. And for people in our factories and in our science labs who had to come in, it was also stressful. And so these kinds of company-wide benefits, the allowance, the focus days, the wellness time, it really allowed the 85,000 people at Pfizer, I believe, to feel cared for at what was a difficult time.
Mm.
And I think that's important.
What do you do for yourself during, not just, during those years, during, that COVID thing, but, just in general, what do you do for yourself?
I allow myself downtime. I, as I said, I really enjoyed long walks, and on the weekends, I'll get up to 3, 4 miles, and it feels great. I appreciate every chance and take advantage of every chance to be in nature when I can. I love to read and to write, and I really enjoy and get a ton of energy from quiet pursuits.
Mhm. I noticed that you spent some time in Sag Harbor. We spent a couple of years there in Sag Harbor,
You
and
did?
lots of nature there. And as long as you stay
Yeah.
away from the ticks, you're okay. That seems to
Mhm.
be an issue, but beautiful area.
It's a beautiful place. It's a really saved me during the pandemic.
Yes, yeah.
Mhm.
It's
Mhm.
about an hour, I think, if I remember from the city, if you're
On a
driving.
good day. On a
On
good
a
day.
Yes, getting across the Tappan Zee Bridge. Holy cow! And other places. But anyway, you like to read, you like to walk. Um, what are you reading these days?
Well, I like to read I mix it up. I enjoy business stories. I recently read the book by the Disney CEO, Bob Iger. Bob Iger has written a business memoir that's very good. He
Mm.
shares a lot. So I enjoyed reading that. I read poetry. I read fiction. I really try to mix it up.
Yes. You have a favorite poet? I just
Of
read
course,
or
Mary
reread.
Oliver.
What's that?
Mary Oliver is my
Okay.
favorite poet.
Okay.
I know she's a bit of a populist in the poetry field, but I'm a big fan. Do you
Yes.
have a Do you have a favorite poet?
Thanks for asking. I have a favorite writer right now, and that's E.B. White. I'm in love with E.B. White. He is incredible. And his One Man's Meat, which is a collection of his essays after he moved from New York City to Maine to live on the coast in Maine. He was at his peak and his prime. That's just unbelievable stuff. Um, I just read Maya Angelou again, and her I Will Rise poem
Mm,
is like incredible, just incredible. I'd forgotten all about it. You know what I mean? You just sort of hear
yeah.
the language of rise, and
Hmm.
that's that's incredible. I was just thinking on my shelf, if I think most of those are upstairs, but I'm reading some Robert Frost right now. Uh, yeah, he's wonderful too. So anyway, uh, you're reading. You just read Iger. you like some poetry, you like some fiction. I wanted to ask you about your writing. I wanted to ask you about how do you find time and what's your practice for writing?
So I feel I've been a writer my whole life. When I was a kid, I was deep in the Laura Ingalls Wilder books, the Nancy Drew mysteries, and even made a little newspaper for my neighborhood that I think only my parents read. But I think of being a writer is an identity. What changed for me of late was to become an author
Mm,
and to have my work out in the world in this way. And for years, I wrote small pieces, published a little something here or there. But it was really during the pandemic when I was as busy as I've ever been in my career. And we were really working around the clock to try to bring the vaccine forward as quickly as possible, that all my thoughts and ideas crystallized.
mm,
And I began to write much more quickly, more dependably. I'm an early riser like you are, and I would spend a good 45 minutes in the morning writing, and sometimes I'd get pages, and other times just a couple sentences. But writing while I watched the sun come up over the cove by my house was very restorative and very gratifying, and ideas that I had been ruminating on for decades crystallized in the heat of the pandemic when I was working and putting into practice all these things I was thinking about, needing to be intentional, wanting to remain curious, being reflective. And so I'm in that way grateful to the pandemic, if I can say that, for focusing me and giving me this opportunity to write Breaking Through.
hmm Laura, when you mentioned Laura Ingalls Wild and the Little House on the Prairie and that kind of stuff, reminded me of your comments about cancel culture. And thanks for that, by the way. I'm a huge fan of Ted Geisel, Dr. Seuss.
Yes.
And I mentioned Dr. Seuss online, and there's always some folk who just, thanks for bringing up a racist. And, his biography, Becoming Dr. Seuss, is incredible. His story is amazing. It's like we have to be careful judging the past through the lens of the present. I know we have to, and sometimes it's appropriate, but I mean, Mark Twain, my goodness, I love Mark Twain, but his language is a little rough here for modern people.
I'll always be grateful to Laura Ingalls for giving me an imagination as a young girl. And I used to dream of being in the big woods with Ma and Pa, and, a pioneering spirit. And, having her along with me was deeply meaningful. And what she wrote about were the standards of her time. And I think it's important that we know what those standards are and that we think back on them and we can reflect on them in light of current day. But she should not be obliterated, in my view, for telling her story as she lived it. And I learned from looking back and thinking, oh gosh, we would never say that now. And I wonder if there can't be real teaching moments on these kind of things where you hold a discussion, if it's in a classroom setting or in a book club, and say, what has changed since those days? What do we feel about those changes? Those are very legitimate conversations. But the idea that we hold people of the past accountable to the rules of a time they couldn't even imagine seems grossly unfair and beneath our capacity as people to be sympathetic and empathetic. So I'm glad we're raising this point. Thank you.
Yes. Well, your book has 10 tenets of leadership, 10 concepts. What's your favorite? Do you have a favorite child?
Ooh, the favorite child among the 10. Um, I think it would have to be intentionality.
Okay.
And that is the first one. And maybe that's why I made it the first one. But to really stop and take a moment before you begin anything and say to yourself, what is it I really want to say here? I did it before we began our phone call today, and I was hoping to make a connection with you, and I'm grateful for that chance. But even on simple things, when I speak to my parents or my young adult daughter, and I stop and I say, I need to be patient with my parents, or I need to just listen with my daughter. And taking that breath, that moment before we do things, and ask ourselves, why are we doing it? Because I feel often I see people give a speech and I wonder, why are they talking? Or I'll read something that I'm not sure why it was written. And so centering your intention is perhaps the most valuable of all the tenets.
Mm, love that. Thank you for that. Little moments. I do the same thing before conversations. I try to do 50-minute hours. I don't like
Mm.
60-minute hours. And then before I would have a conversation with someone like you or a coaching client or whatever, is I close my eyes, breathe a little bit, I review my notes. Before I think about how what I respect about them. I think about how I want to show up.
Mhm.
And boy, it makes such a difference. You don't feel like you're hijacked all the time.
It makes a big difference. I love your thought of the 50-minute hour. I think Zoom um, put us too much on these sort of 30-minute cycles where you don't even have time to catch your breath. And it's so important. And it makes a big difference for communicators. People can feel it when you're focused, centered, still before you begin.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, intentionality is your favorite. Which one did you find the most challenging to write?
The most challenging tenet to write was without question the one about pitch.
Mm,
And I appreciate that you talk about my book as a leadership book because that's how I think about it. And that's why I'm so pleased to be working with HBR Press because they're great thinkers in leadership. Um, but sometimes people confuse it as just a communications book or a public relations book. And they think the pitch is going to be about how to make an elevator pitch or how to pitch a story to a newspaper. And to me, that's not of interest. I'm not in any way trying to teach to that or drive to that. My notion of pitch is something really much higher and more musical than managerial. It's about having a tone that is welcoming, using word choices that people understand as opposed to jargon. It's about telling your story in a way that brings the listener in and doesn't make them feel inferior to you or different to you. And it was a hard chapter to write because it's a bit of an esoteric notion, and also because I'm a little critical of someone I admire in that chapter. I admire Hillary Clinton. I think she's a very smart woman and a very hardworking woman in government. But I analyzed her candidacy as having failed because of her inability to have pitch. She didn't have pitch in my view. And when, as a presidential candidate on the stump, she needed a soaring rhetoric, she often sounded technical or negative. So that was a tough chapter to get my mind around and to hopefully write in a way that readers understand that I'm talking about something that is very personal and very inner focused, but deeply, deeply powerful in connecting with people.
hmm. Hmm. Yes, when I I read Perfect Pitch, that's where your mind goes to, your elevator speech, clarifying the message, etc. So it took me a little bit to get my mind around the chapter because I came with an assumption to it. And then it's all of a sudden, no, no, that's not what this is. That's not what the main focus here is.
Right. And I talk about a great leader, Ken Chenault, who was CEO of American Express less than a year when its headquarters were right there at the source of the 9/11 attack, and the economy, plummeted, and that's essential to Ken's business. And he invited all the colleagues together in Madison Square Garden tore up his speech, spoke from the heart. And people talk about it to this day because Ken found the right pitch.
Yes.
And that's what I am trying to advocate for.
Mm-hmm. Who is pouring into your life these days? You've talked, I know your dad was a huge influence in your life, is a huge influence in your life. Paul, of course. Well, who's pouring into your life these days?
Such a great question. Um, now that we are back in the office after nearly 2.5 years of having worked remotely, I feel very much the warmth and the presence of my colleagues, and working alongside of them. And we've now moved into a sort of semi-open plan structure, which I was very negative about. I was dreading it. I like the quiet. I'm an introvert by nature, but I have found the pleasure and joy of having my colleagues around me really filling me with ideas and new challenges and things to think about for the future of the company. And so I'm sort of retaking my vows to in-office working these days, and the joy of being with my team and the team I'm on, and really grateful for that.
Mm-hmm. I wondered if you might be an introvert. The story about going to China and like, okay, I'm just going to get into the hotel room. I'm going to have room service and cuddle up with some pillows and,
Yeah.
be by myself. And I forget the person's name, but they basically drug you out into the city in the end of the day.
Yes. Yes. When I started working at the Estee Lauder companies, I had the honor to travel to China with their vice chairman at the time, Jeanette Sarkassian Wagner, who was a battle axe, big shoulders for work, opened all the international markets for the Estee Lauder companies. And she allowed me to go with her on a business trip to Beijing. And I was in my early 40s. She was in her late 70s. And at the end of our first very long day with jet lag and many many meetings, I was dreaming of the bathtub at the hotel and a nice hamburger from room service. And she looked at me and she said, "Do you have plans?" And I mean, plans. I didn't know a single person in Beijing. It was my first trip to China as a businesswoman, and I said no. She says, "Well, you're coming with me," and literally took me by the hand to what turned out to be a very late night at a friend of hers who had been living in China for many years. And the next day, after a long day of work, she took me to an art gallery, and she explained to me the importance of getting out in the world, in the places we get to travel as business people, and not just go to the airport, the conference room, the hotel, and back. So I have made that my practice. And I often hear Jeanette in my ears when she would say to me, "Dear, jet lag is boring." And she was right.
Good stuff. Good stuff. Well, I've been chatting with Sally Susman, and she's the chief corporate affairs officer at Pfizer, and her book is out today, March 28th. And I I was delighted to read it, and I'm thankful that somebody sent it to me, and then offered a conversation with somebody who works for the evil empire, and is trying to make the world a better place. Thank you so much for your time today, Sally.
Thank you, Dan. It's been an honor and a joy.